action.
Hi, I'm Jeff Dean, here to show you today how to solder copper joints using a propane solder setup. Today we're going to talk about, first off, some of the materials that we'll be using. I have some scrap pieces of copper that I picked up from a previous job. If you'll take a notice, this copper tube has red lettering on it and kind of like a red type paint. This lettering in this paint tells you what kind of copper tubing that we're working with. This is going to be something that you use for potable drinking water in a residential type home. Okay, so whenever you're selecting materials, these are things that you have to consider. Next thing I want to talk about is the thickness. This is what's considered a Schedule 40 copper tube. Just has to do with the material thickness, and this is as well a 1/2 inch in diameter copper tubing. It's really common in residential and business type settings. Next thing I want to talk about is PPE, some of our safety gear that we're going to be using. We always want to start out with covering and protecting your eyes. You want to use a Z87-1 approved lens and frame type work, or better, to help protect your eyes. Always have these on. It helps protect your eyes. This is a very important thing. Next thing, we want to have a good pair of leather gloves to wear. Now, they don't have to be a welding type glove like these are. This is what I just happen to have on hand to use. They can be a work glove. I'm going to wear a leather apron, something that you do not have to wear while doing solder fittings. However, is something that I'm going to wear just to help keep some of the solder off of me. I don't want to get burned. Solder comes off your clothing fairly easily, but burns don't come off your body too easily. So any and all things that I can do to help protect myself, I will. Alright guys, now we briefly talked about the type of materials that we're going to be using, okay? And I pointed out that we're going to be using a propane torch. This propane torch setup like this, it comes in a set. It comes with the brush, the burning nozzle, some solder, and flux. You can pick this up at Walmart in a kit for like $20. Very well worth the money. Okay. Something else I want to talk about in particular, this solder. Whenever we're talking about potable water, potable drinking water, we want to use a 95.5, what's called a 95.5 solder, or a silver bearing solder. It's a lead-free solder. Obviously, people don't like lead drinking water, so for many different reasons. One, it's poisonous. Okay. Some of the things that we'll be using: tape measure. This so happens to be a 25-foot tape measure. You can use a 16-foot tape measure, all the way down to a 6-foot tape measure. Guys, it really doesn't matter. It's whatever you're comfortable with using, okay? We're using a deburr tool. This is used for deburring your copper tube or your copper piping. Has a male end that you insert into the piping itself, and it deburrs. It takes little burrs off the inside edge of the tubing, okay? And then you have a female end as well, and what that does, it takes burrs off the outside. And you hear me talk about burrs. Well, Mr. Dean, what are you talking about burrs? Whenever we cut this tubing with this tube cutter, it kind of pushes out the metal and it leaves a sharp edge. For one, that sharp edge can cut you, obviously, but for two, whenever you're inserting it into your fitting, that can be detrimental to how well it sits down into your fitting and how well it solders. Okay? Now, I'm going to measure out 5 inches. Okay, we use a Sharpie here. Typically, you're going to use a low sodium, or not low sodium, excuse me, guys, low chloride type marker, high alloy type copper, or high alloy steel rather, and copper. Chlorides can be detrimental to the surface of your copper tubing, and high alloy stainless steel type tubings and piping. So low chloride Sharpie markers are highly recommended. Next, you notice I have my mark here. I want to line my cutting wheel up with my mark. I want to bring my cutting wheel to where it's firmly against the tubing. I want to make a revolution and then tighten it. A revolution and then tighten it. What this is doing is I'm making this revolution, it's pushing that wheel into the copper. And as I turn this, it pushes it farther and farther, eventually cutting it. Simple as that. Next, I want to take my deburr tool, insert it into the inside of the tube. Doesn't take much to take the burrs out, and you know, it takes just a few minutes to do a job right. It can take hours to fix it not done right. So we always want to try to work smart and not hard. If you can see on the inside of this lip is taking that burr off the inside. Now I'm going to do the outside of it. Again, you see the outside, it has a light bevel or an angle, and it is taking the burr off of this tubing. Next step, I'm going to take some 80 to 120 grit sandpaper. In this demonstration, I'm using 120 grit sandpaper to clean the exterior of our tube. I want to look and see how far down this goes onto the copper, and just put a little light mark there, guys. This lets me know about how far I need to clean. I will step past it just to make sure that everything gets cleaned properly. Aside from cleaning this, this also helps the solder itself adhere to the material better. Once the exterior of your copper is sufficiently clean, you want to take, if you don't have a wire brush, a lot of people like to use a wire brush on the inside of their fittings. It's just as easy to roll your sandpaper up and insert it to the inside of your fitting. Cleaning the inside of the fitting is necessary. It helps clean the inside, it helps with the capillary action or the flow of the material going inside this socket. You want to catch this outside lip as well because the solder will adhere to this as well. You see me blowing this out, obviously we want to look and make sure there's no dirt or anything inside there. And that's all I'm doing is blowing it out, making sure that it's clean. Next step, you heard me talking about this flux paste. This flux paste, you brush it on lightly with a little flux type brush, okay? What the flux does, it helps clean any impurities that are on the surface of the material. You want to add it to the inside of your fitting, as well as the exterior of your copper tube. It doesn't take a whole lot to do this, and if you use too much, have your little rag here on hand to wipe off excess. Now, inserting it, you want to push it in, do kind of a turning motion. That kind of helps set in your flux paste. Now, if there's any excess flux at this time, you would take it, just lightly wipe. You want to leave some flux on, but if there's excess, you want to take it off, okay? Now, obviously a good work table comes in handy. However, in a pinch, you can use the tailgate of a truck and a quick clamp such as this, okay? Once our work is secured, I'll tell you what, let me move this on the other side just to where everybody can see a little bit better. Yeah. Okay, once your work is secured, you're ready to start assembling your torch. Now, I have a basic propane torch. It doesn't have a gauge type regulator to it, and I don't need a striker to ignite this. It has an electric striker built into it. Fairly inexpensive and works really well. Now, I do have a regulator of sorts, we could say, to help adjust how much propane gas is coming out. Okay? Put our gloves on. We don't want to get burned. Next, we want to take our solder and run us out a good bit. I like to take it, bend it a little bit. Helps me whenever I'm doing a horizontal joint. Okay? Now, everything's out of the way that we need out of the way. Anytime you have anything flammable, move it out of your way. That way you don't have to worry about catching something on fire, guys. Alright. I'm going to lightly igniting the torch. Simple as that. Again, push button. Don't have to have a striker to strike it off. We can adjust our gas flow with this. Okay. Now, starting with the horizontal joint, and y'all may have noticed I had to move my clip around. It's just a little bit safer and easier to use it this way for demonstration purposes. Now, as we start to heat this, we want to start on the bottom. We want to lightly heat our fitting, as well as give our copper tube some attention as well. I also added in a block of wood to keep the heat of the copper from melting the plastic on the tailgate of my truck. Safety precaution. This is also called sweating copper, and the reason being is this heats up. It'll look like little beads of sweat, and it's really hard to show on a video, but this flux will turn into like little black beads of sweat. That's what they call sweating the copper. Now, another way to check your heat is to lightly wipe your solder, and it's almost to temperature, but not quite. We'll heat it a little bit more, and then we'll check it again. We're almost there. Here we are. If you'll notice, the solder kind of sucks into it. That's called a capillary action, which is a good thing. We'll chase it or follow it up with the heat towards the top. Again, pushing our solder into it. Guys, if little puddles form, it's not a big deal to knock it off. It's more of a cosmetic thing, but it's not necessarily a bad thing. You can leave it on there. But to make your work look a little bit more professional, take time and wipe it off. Again, we're following it around, just lightly pushing it in, making sure everything's covered. Make sure it's all evenly coated. Turn off your torch. Set it to the side. Make sure that there's nobody around that you can burn or anything. Put that down. And you let it sit and cool. Now, as I stated, there will be little clumps here and there, but the joint is full of solder, so it's properly sealed. Okay? You don't want, like I said, you don't want to twist it or anything. Let it cool off. Usually takes 2 to 3 minutes to let it cool off properly, but as it cools off, it helps solidify this and will be a very solid joint. Okay? Again, I'm Jeff Dean. I'm glad you guys got to participate today. Now let's go do something good. Y'all have a good one, guys.
Mr. Dean, where do I get the safety gear from?
Well, Wyatt, that's a great question. You can pick up your safety gear at retail locations such as Fastenal. A lot of times Atwoods will have it. Walmart, Lowe's, and the Home Depot as well. So there's always great places that you can go. There's different resources on the internet, and there's a whole lot more that you can look up on there. Is there any other questions?
No, sir. Thank you.
Did that answer it thoroughly?
Yes. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Mr. Dean, what temperature does the solder melt at?
Well, that's a great question. Solder melts typically somewhere between 360 and 450 degrees Fahrenheit. If it gets above 460 degrees Fahrenheit, it becomes difficult to actually solder the joint, and it's pretty much incapable. Going up above that would be considered a hard solder, and you'd have to have a different material to do so. Is there anything else?
No, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ready? What is capillary action?
Hi, Ariel. That's a great question. Capillary action is whenever solder gets drawn into this part of the joint. As the heating process is occurring, the solder is drawn into the socket and feels its way around the fitting and the pipe itself. That is a great question, and I hope that you're enjoying this course.